know, today we're going to do something just a little bit different. We're going to talk about how you build a good, dramatic story so people will be interested in hearing about it and telling it to somebody else. Because all good stories have reasons for being. They don't just happen out of the blue. Every one of them have a reason for being, and they are written for a person to tell or to write it on a piece of paper so that someone else might know what they are trying to communicate. We try to tell our children, don't do that, that's dangerous. But if we start talking about how they can be involved in a story situation, and there might be an animal of some kind or a ghost or something, they will understand that sometimes you have to be kind of careful about being able. Now, I'm going to assume, and I hope that I'm assuming right, that each of you want to be able to communicate ideas. Because, child, if you don't do it, who in the world will? Who is going to tell your story so that people say, oh, I wish I'd been there then. Or I wish I had heard a beautiful young lady just 5 minutes ago say, I wish I could see that. I wish I could have been there. We all still want to go through our memories. You know, memories are kind of strange things in that you can't erase them. Because if you do, what you have left is simply a hole with nothing in it. And you don't want your memories to be an empty memory. You don't want it to be a hole with nothing in it. They're your stories. And so because of that, you've got to be able to do different things with different kinds of information. Now, I've told several stories this year, some that are based on fact. Some of them I'm relating from my relatives, my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, and friends that I've known. It's very important for you to create an atmosphere and create skills that you are able to relate your story so other people can look forward to it and enjoy it. Now, you need to know about some things you just got to know about. Just like if I'm going to build a house, I've got to have something to build it and some place to build it and what it's going to look like. You see, you've got to have the substantial skills to be able to put a story together. For instance, you really, really do need to know how to string words together in such a way. For instance, if I said the dog barked, that doesn't draw a picture for you. But if I say the big black dog hunkered down in the doorway and began to lift its nose up and howl at the moon, that's a story beginning right there. You think, what in the flim-flam's going on? So that dog might sit down and that dog becomes a big black dog because I planted those ideas in you with just stringing words together. Simple little ordinary words and setting a beginning of a plot. That's what we teachers and older people say when you got to have a plot. And that plot's got to take some sort of information there. Then you certainly do need to know that you've got to have a story that will develop and be more than just one paragraph long. Who in the world wants to know just a little about the dog and then you don't hear what happened and who it happened to and what were the consequences of? Good heavens above, child. Don't you know those things are important because they're yours? Just like I think my old stories are important because they're mine. I relate them from the people I heard a long time ago. Then now you've got to use the habit, or the habit I call, of having a rhythm or rhyme. Can you remember the very first time when you were a little boy or girl and your mama picked you up, or grandma, somebody picked you up, put you in their lap, and started singing, "Oh, the old King Cole was a merry," and started a poem or a song that has rhythm, like, "Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle and the cow jumped over the moon. Oh, the little dog laughed to see such sport. And the dish ran away with the spoon." Nursery rhymes, rhythm, and things that poetry that could be made into songs, like all the things that you, and those are some of the warmest feelings we bring to us. I can still remember my grandmothers and my great-grandmothers pulling me up in their laps and telling me about when they were a little boy or girl. And I still love to tell those stories because they're beautiful and warm. And then everybody had superstitions that they appreciated. What's a superstition that you might remember? I bet every one of you got one. If I drop a mirror, somebody say, "Oh, Miss Sills, you're going to have some years of bad luck." I can remember one time, Mama and I started church in our old beat-up Chevrolet, about 36 Chevrolet, a long time ago. And Mama and I were dressed to go to church. At that time, boys and girls, if you went to church on Sunday morning, you wore gloves and a hat and the best clothes you owned. And we were driving down the road when all of a sudden, wing, right in front of that car, a black cat. When Mom said, "Oh, my, my, my." And we hadn't got time to go back home. Well, I looked at Mama thinking, what in the world is she talking about? I said, "What do you mean, Mama? She said, "Don't you know that was a black cat that run across? And if we don't turn around and go home, we will have a whole long period of time with bad luck." And I said, "Mama, not really." She said, "Of course, if I could turn around the car and go back home, but we haven't got time. But if I could turn some of my clothing around," and I looked at that up on her head. She had this beautiful Sunday hat with a big old peony flower right here on front. And Mama laughed. She said, "I know what I'm going to do." And she reached up and turned that hat backwards, so the peony flower was on the back of her. And she laughed. She said, "Now I've broken the charm and they won't have bad luck." And I thought, but I see people run every once in a while. I have even gone so far myself as to go inside the restroom and turn a blouse that I had inside out and put it back on so I wouldn't have bad luck. You know, our superstitions are important to us if we believe in them. It's either kind of funny and we laugh about it, just like we laugh about witches and ghosts and goblins and fairy godmothers and giants and creatures that come creeping and crawling in at night. We have a good time, you know, when we talk about these things. We have a wonderful time. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories today, both of them just kind of short, choppy bits and pieces, like if I was putting together a puzzle and I put a piece here and get a piece from over here and put. I'm going to tell you, you listen and compare the way because they come from two different times in history. They come from two different places. They have two different plots, and yet they were somebody's stories. Listen, and I'm going to tell the first one comes from my very, very favorite book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Now, I know, surely, by the time most of you boys and girls have gotten this far in school, you've either seen it on television or you've read it in a book, because it is absolute. Written by a man named Mark Twain, who was a great historian, and he was also a great comedian. He loved to laugh, and his stories were filled with laughter and excitement and drama and things that were happening that you just couldn't hardly wait to see what it was going to be next. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And listen to how this little excerpt, just a bit and piece from that book, comes. It started out like this. Old Tom was walking down the sidewalk, and who should he meet up with but Huckleberry Finn. Now, Huckleberry Finn was everything Tom wishes he was, because Huckleberry Finn didn't belong to anybody. His daddy was, well, I hate to say this, but it was the truth. His daddy was the town drunk, and he didn't take care of him, not one bit. And his mama, dead and gone from the moment that Huckleberry Finn drew his very first breath. Huckleberry was walking down the street, and he had on an old pair of overalls with one gallus that went over, and he was barefooted, and he hadn't had a bath in maybe, no, not since he was down swimming in the river, I guess, because they lived up the Mississippi River in Missouri, and it was a wild and woolly place. A little small town with a big cemetery about a mile up on top of the hill. And Huckleberry was rocking down the street, and people, it was a sight to see. He had an old dead cat on a string, and around his head he was swinging that dead cat. And Tom says, Huckleberry, where are you going? He says, well, I was looking to find you. And Tom says, find me? What for? I want you to go summers with me tonight. Where do you want me to go? Said Tom. I want you to go with me up to the cemetery on the top of Cardiff Hill up there. Tom says, tonight? I don't much like to go around cemeteries of a night. You know, I ain't too sure, Huck, how dead folks feel about us coming roaming around in the middle of the night in the place where they're trying to rest. He said, Tom, you're my friend, and you usually do these things with me. He says, I want you to go with me. I'm going to come and get you right before midnight, and we're going up to the cemetery on top of Cardiff Hill. Tom said, why? He says, well, I'm aiming to cure my warts with it. He said, what do you mean you're aiming to cure? He said, look there, Tom. I got warts here, and I got warts here, and I got warts. He said, I got more warts because I play with the frogs considerable. And you know, if a frog wets on you, it makes a wart. Now, all boys back in those days were not as smart as you are. They really believed that if you got wet on by a frog, that you would have warts come on you. And he said, well, wait, Tom says, wait, Huck, says, I know how to cure warts. Says, Ben Rogers told me, and you know what? Ben Rogers he's been all the way to the county seat. He's as smart as any boy in this town. Huck said, how'd he say do? He said, well, you take a dried butterbean seed, and you break it in two, in half. And you take a needle, and you force a drop of blood on your finger, and you put it right on one side of that butterbean, and you go out in the middle of the night where two roads go right across each other. And right at the stroke of midnight, you kneel down and you make a little hole in the ground. And you put that half of butterbean seed in that ground and pat it and cover it over. And you jump up, turn around 3 times and run home. And he said, in about 2 weeks' time, you put the other half in your pocket. About 2 weeks' time, he said, you kind of feel something a pulling and a tugging at you. And he says, the first thing you know, Huck, you'll take that butterbean out and that blood will be gone and it'll be whole again and your warts will be healed. Huck said, huh, that ain't so. I've done tried it, and it ain't the truth. Well, let me tell you what another friend says. He says, go down to the swampland where there's a stump hole out there, an old pine stump hole, and says where the water's collected and made a little pool. You back up to that and you stick your arm that's got all them warts in it and you say, barley corn, engine mill shorts, stump water, swallow these warts. And again, don't speak to anybody, go home, and it says it'll cure any wart. Huckleberry said, nope, that ain't so, because I've done tried it 3 times and it didn't work. But he says, they tell me, if you take a dead cat and you go into the cemetery, the 3rd day after they bury somebody that's real evil, that on the stroke of midnight, the devil comes right straight down from you know where, Tom. And he says, the devil comes and gets the soul of that man, and he takes it back down to where he came from. And you sling that cat after that devil. And you say, cat follow devil, warts follow cat. I'm done with you. And he says, then you sit there just as quiet so that devil won't know you've been spying on him in the middle of the night. And he says, that'll fetch any wart that's ever been. He said, Tom, you know that man they hung last week, that they buried last Friday, said, tonight's the night. The devil's going to come to get his soul. Tom says, yeah, but Huck, like I say, I don't much like to go around dead folks much anyway. Why, we'll be together. And he said, they won't. He said, do you reckon them dead folks, Tom said that to Huck, so you reckon they mind us coming in there like that and moving around and disturbing their street? Huck kind of grinned. He said, Tom, I've lived long enough to tell you for the truth. I'm a lot more feared of us live folks around here than I am those dead folks up there in the hill on Cardiff Hill. He said, them live folks ain't going to pay no attention to us at all. I'll be there just about 11:30. Well, when Tom got ready to go to bed that night, he thought, I need to get in bed quick so I'll hear Huck when he meows for me. Because that's how Huck would signal Tom. And he bed his excuse to Aunt Polly, and he said, Aunt Polly, I'm plumb tired tonight. Well, she was kind of worried about, because Tom didn't ever want to go to bed at night. He liked to stay up and talk and play outside in the dark and so forth. She reached over to feel of his forehead, and she said, well, you do feel a bit warm. She said, mind you now, you say your prayers. And he says, oh, my Aunt Polly, you know I always say my prayers. And up the stairway he went to bed. Now, he didn't undress. He just took his shoes off and put them under the edge of the bed, climbed in that bed and covered up, waiting to hear Huckleberry meow. Well, it weren't long, sure enough, till you heard click, click, click. What in the world is that? Said Tom. And he recognized it was a cricket, and it's in the wall of the house. Now, another superstition that Tom had, that is, if an insect got inside the walls of a house and went into the bedroom, they started clicking like that. They were, somebody in that room's life was numbered. And every time it made a click sound, it meant another time was added. And he began to worry, who you reckon that cricket's talking about? Because Tom surely believed that was a superstition he believed very well. And he thought, what do you reckon he's trying to tell me? Well, he's laying there, and he heard Aunt Polly and Sid and Mary come up and go to bed. And then he was laying just quiet, and all of a sudden he heard, meow, meow. There was Huck. And sure enough, he went to the window, very carefully opened the window so Aunt Polly wouldn't hear it, and looked out. Sure, there stood old Huck, still slinging that dead cat on a string. He, shh, don't wake Aunt Polly. And he clumb out on the window and jumped down in the alley, and they started up the road to Cardiff Hill. Well, they hadn't gone half a block when this old dog was sitting in the middle of the road. And when he saw them boys come walking up, he sat right down and he turned that nose up at the sky and he went, oh, oh. Tom said, oh, Lord, Huck, he must be talking about us. Look. Because another superstition Tom had was that when an animal, a stray animal like that one was, started howling, it sure enough meant that whomever he was closest to, his days was numbered. And Huck says, well, Tom, I guess he's talking about both of us. We're right here together. But wait, look, he's pointed that old shed down there. And Tom said, who you reckon's in that shed? And they tiptoed down and looked in there, and there, lying in the moonlight, was Muff Potter. Muff Potter, bless his heart, didn't have a enemy in the world, but he never did have a home or much, and he was sound asleep and snoring like you ain't never. And Huck says, well, Tom, I reckon it's talking about old Muff. I hate to see that, 'cause he shared his food with me lots of times. Yeah, said Tom, but what the time says, the Spirit does, and he's sure bound for the promised land. And they went on walking. Well, they got up to the cemetery. Now, it was just about a mile from that cemetery down to town. You could look down at the town near the river, and you could see lamps burning in some houses and everything. And they opened up that squeaky gate and went walking very carefully across toward where the brand new grave was turned up, right under a great big sycamore tree. And then there were sumac bushes all around that sycamore tree. And Huck says, Tom, let's get over there in them sumac bushes and hunker down. The devil won't be able to see us there, and we want to be careful. And so both boys hunkered down and sat quietly, waiting for the devil to come to take the man's soul back to you know where. Well, it weren't long till sure enough they heard something. Boys and girls, look down that dark road. It looked like some sort of lantern going here and there, back and forth. And they could hear the crunch of gravel. Did devils make the gravels crunch? Were they solid enough for that? And both boys just almost quit breathing altogether because Huck said, oh, Tom, I'd rather it was the devil. But that ain't the devil. There's three men a coming, and one of them's Injun Joe. Oh, Lord, Tom, that man wouldn't think any more about drowning us than he would that cat there. What are we going to do if he finds out we're here? Shh. He said, Huck, can you pray? Huck said, Tom, you know I ain't a church-going man, but I'd pray if I could. Tom said, now lay me down to sleep and pray the Lord my soul. Shh. And across those three men came across right toward that lump, that grave there in the yard. And Injun Joe was pushing a wheelbarrow. And he had ropes and shovels and everything. And he turned around and he said, Doctor. And sure enough, one of the other men was the young doctor that had just come to town that let it be known that he wanted to examine bodies, human bodies, to find out what made them die and everything. And he said, Doctor, if you don't pay us $25 more, then that body is going to stay in that grave. And he said, fellas, I've already paid you now. And I ain't going to pay you another cent, not 1 cent more. And so Huck, the Injun Joe, and the doctor began to fight, and fight hard. The other man was old Muff Potter, the very man they'd left asleep when the dog was howling. And he said, "Stop, Joe, stop. He's done paid us. We can't renege on him right now." But Injun Joe didn't pay up any more attention. He grabbed up a big log and swung it, and Lord have mercy, young'uns, I hate to tell you, but it knocked that new doctor over stone cold dead, and he fell across the grave, and he was bloody. And Injun Joe looked, said, "Fool," and he looked over, and he saw Muff Potter wasn't quite at himself, and he reached in Muff Potter and got his knife out and stabbed the doctor right smack dab in the heart. And the blood gushed up and went all over Muff Potter, and it fell all over the grave. Both boys quit breathing entirely. Tom looked up at fully expecting to see a thunderstorm right straight from God, because that man had just killed the other man right in front of their eyes. And of course, nobody knowed they was there. And then the Injun Joe sit down, and Muff Potter finally waked up from being hit so hard with that log, and he says, "Injun Joe, what happened?" And Injun Joe said, "Muff Potter, you ought not have done it." "Ought not have done what? Joe, what did I do? What did I do?" He said, "Well, you see your knife there stuck in that man's heart. You killed him." "Oh, Joe, I ain't never hurt nobody. I ain't never drawed that knife out to do anything but clean a fish or something." "Oh, Joe, you ain't going to tell on me, are you, Joe? You ain't going to let them hang me, Joe, are you? Joe." "Oh, Muff, you're my friend. I ain't going to tell, but if you don't get yourself up and out from that body, take yourself down to the river and get rid of all that blood, then I ain't going to be responsible." So poor old Muff Potter jumped up and started running hard as he could toward the river to wash the blood of the dead man away. Old Injun Joe laughed. He said, "Fool. He won't think till about tomorrow that knife of his, that everybody knows is his, is stuck in that man's heart. And they'll know, or they'll think they know, who to blame. They won't even know old Injun Joe was anywheres anyhere." And he turned and walked across the cemetery on the road back down to the village. Both boys was scared plumb nearly to death. Huck said, "Tom, what do you reckon going to happen out of this?" Tom says, "Well, I reckon a hanging's going to come out of it, Joe, just as soon as they know who done it." He said, "Tom, who's going to tell? Us?" "Well, Huck, we can't tell. That vile Indian, if he knows we know, he'll get both of us out and drown us. Sure as our name's Tom and Huck. We got to take and swear." And he reached up and got a piece of sycamore bark off the tree, and he made a little hole with a needle and wrote within his blood, "We, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, do solemnly swear that we ain't never going to tell what happened in the cemetery at Cardiff Hill on this wild night." And he signed it, Tom Sawyer. And he handed the needle to Huck and said, "Now, Huck, sign right here." "Tom, you know I can't write," said Huckleberry, because he had never been to school. "Well, I'll show you how," he said. And he showed Huckleberry how to make an H and an F in blood. And they hung it up in the fork of the sycamore tree. And they left that dead kettle laying there and took off and run back down to the village as fast as their legs would carry it. Now, I ain't going to tell you how that turned out and what the answer. If you want to find, you need to check out at the library The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and find out how this story ends. Because Mark Twain is known today as kind of the father of great cultural literature, especially for younger and middle-aged boys and girls, but adults too. All Americans should learn to appreciate the adventures of Tom Sawyer. Now, another thing, in contrast to when I tell you the stories that Pap told us, they're a different sort of story. Now, no, I don't know that anybody ever wrote Pap stories down. I didn't because I wasn't real good at typewriting. I typed like that. And I never wrote them down myself. But I want to tell you just a little bit of a Jack tale about when Jack got a little bit older. Now, you remember when I told you the story about how Jack got a wagon load of gold? Well, a wagon of gold is not going to last you forever. And sure enough, when Jack got to be older, they had a great famine. Now, if you don't know what a famine is a period of time when it don't rain enough and the people don't raise enough crops and people get hungry. In fact, they get about to starve to death. And Tom and his mother, Jack and his mother, wanted them the story to begin. And he told his mama, he says, "Mama, it's time." She said, "It's time for what, Jack?" "It's time for me to go back into the world and find myself another fortune. Our wagon load of gold is plumb dead and gone." She said, "Oh, Jack, you know, I worked last time." He said, "Mama, I've got to do this. I'm going to leave in the morning." She said, "Well, son, I tell you what, I can't give you anything to take with you. I ain't got much except maybe some cold biscuits and slice of ham or something like that. I'll tell you." And she walked over and took, "Here's your daddy's big old apron that's waterproof." Says, "Take it and put it over your head and put your belongings into it, and so you can have it and not have to take a grip or a suitcase or anything around." And so he got it down and cleaned it up, and early the next morning he started out from home. He told his mother goodbye, and she said, "Be careful, Jack. Now remember to be very, very careful." And Jack started out to earn another fortune. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked, and he walked. Everybody he met, he asked for a job. Everybody he met for a little. But he got down and reached down in his pocket. Well, Mama had put biscuits and sausage and biscuits and ham in those pockets, and he found out that was the last one. And he ate that last biscuit with sausage, and he said, "Last biscuit I've got. That's probably the last mouthful I'm ever going to get, because nobody got a job." And he was walking down this road that he didn't know where he was. He thought, all these houses are strange, and that's a real nice barn and house out there up on the hill. He said, "They look right prosperous. I'll bet they've got some work a feller could do, at least for dinner or something." And he stopped and said, "Hello, the house." In a minute, a man come out on the front porch, and he said, "I do. Who are you, and what can I do for you, young man?" He says, "Sir, I'm looking for a job or work, or at least a mouthful of groceries or something, because I ain't had any food in 2 or 3 days." Well, the man says, "Well, it does so happen that I've got a job that I need somebody to do, but every time I send somebody over there to do that, something happens and it goes all wrong. I don't think you'd better come up here. For one thing, you're too young, and for one thing, you don't seem to have no ability to be a problem solver like this one is. But come on up, we'll talk about it." And he said, "Come on up." And he turned around and said, "Mama, Put another plate on the dinner table, says, we've got company coming. Well, he heard his wife begin to kind of fuss around, and he went in. Jack walked up, and he said, sir, my name's Jack. And he said, well, Jack, I'm the king of this here land as far as you can see in every direction. And he said, Jack, what can you do? Oh, sir, I'm real good around the farm. I know how to muck out a stable. I know how to do things around the farm. I'm pretty good. He said, Jack, how are you at clearing up new ground? Jack says, well, sir, I've done a plenty of it down about the creek. Mom and I plant that land every once in a while, and we have to clear it up and get, he says, you see that land over yonder on the horizon where all them big trees are standing and it's all growed up? He said, that land belongs to me. And every time I send somebody over there to clear it up, there's some giants that live on t'other side that claim it, and they come up there and say, you get out from here, this land belongs to. And if and they don't go, they kill them and take them home, and their mama cooks them for supper. Now, you and I can't think about anybody eating anybody else, but remember, these are by giants now. And giants, they don't really go by the same rules that human beings do. And Jack says, really, sir? He said, yes, sir. He says, I'll tell you what, Jack. If you will take this here job, I'll pay you 50 cents an hour. Now, that's a peck of money. And then, for every giant's head you bring me, I'll give you $1,000. Jack thought, $1,000? Because he thought, that's more money there is in this world. That old man's just talking. But he says, well, sir, and he said, Jack, how are you at killing giants? Jack thought, well, don't know. I ain't never even seen no giant, much less know anything about one. He said, Jack, I'll tell you what. He said, come on and eat lunch, and we'll talk to Mama, and I'll give you directions. And they went inside, and the queen said, now, Jack, you go over yonder to the washstand and wash your face and hands. Don't nobody come to my table to eat without their hands and face clean. Oh, thank you, ma'am. I appreciate and obliged to you. My mama's the same way. I know how to do that. And so he sat down, and people, you have not ever seen what a magnificent table filled with food Jack hadn't even seen in years and years. Oh, he could smell the dumplings, and he could taste all them good things. And he thought, oh, gracious. And so the queen began to serve the king and Jack and herself. And they ate, and they didn't seem to want to stop eating. Jack ate till he couldn't put another bite in his mouth. He thought, if I let this man and woman know I can't eat as much as they can, they're not going to let me work for them. So he thought, I'll just hide. And sure enough, he'd take one of those pockets open in that, remember that apron he had on was waterproof, and he'd pour milk down in that one, and then he'd take one and he'd put beans down in it, he'd put taters down in that. He soon had those pockets, everyone just cram jam full of food. When all of a sudden the wife stopped and she said, now, husband, you're not about to send this child over there to kill them giants. He'll end up in their kitchen, dead as a doornail, and be cooked and ate for supper. The king's looking at me. He says, you know what? He takes care of himself, and he seems to know how to take care of himself. And I'm aiming to chance him. He said, Jack, you go out to the wood pile and pick you out a good axe. And you go over to that place and clear up that place. And remember, I'm paying you 50 cents an hour for every hour you work. But remember, even more, you get $1,000 for every head of a giant you bring. So Jack walked out to the wood pile and picked up a big old double-bladed axe. And he thought, whoo, that's heavy. I couldn't fight anything. If I had it, it's way too heavy. And he found a little hatchet with just one head on it. He said, that's sort of what I need. And he put that down in his scabbard and started walking to the hillside across near the horizon. And it all of a sudden dawned on Jack. What have I got myself into? I don't know nothing about killing no giants. I ain't never in my whole life even seen a giant, he thought. What in the world have I done? But he kept on a-walking right up toward the tip top of the hill. Right on the tip top of that hill, there was a big old sycamore tree, reached up now to 50, 60 feet tall, limbs just right for climbing. And he thought, if I was up in the top of that sycamore tree, I could look down in every direction, and I could see if a giant started up here. And I sure wouldn't let anything get up close to me. So he began to climb up the sycamore tree. And he got way up at the top, and he was looking down, and he couldn't see nothing. He could see the castle where the king and queen lived way over the hill. And he thought, you know what? I believe, he said. And he reached over and took the hatchet and chopped off a big old limb. And he let that limb drop down to the young'uns. You have never heard such a noise as that. It crashed against the tree, and it crashed against the limbs, and it knocked leaves this way and that, and finally it hit the ground, kerchunk. And Jack sat there and listened. Couldn't see nothing coming, but seemed like he could hear something away off. So he reached out and cut another limb off and let it tumble and growl and grumble all of its way down to the ground, and there it lay. And sure enough, Jack looked down. Good heavens above! Up the hill come a giant. I'm talking to you, a bona fide giant. It was as tall almost as a pine sapling, and it had 2 heads. I ain't lying to you. That giant had 2 heads, and the heads was talking to each other. And one of them said to the other and says, Brother, I tell you, I heard some noise from up there. There's some fool up here trying to cut our land off again. Well, the other head, and this was the main one, said, we're going to eat good tonight. We'll take supper home, and Mama can bake him up in a big old pan of dressing. And they began looking all over the hillside. And Jack was all hunkered down up in the top of that tree. He thought, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Oh, good gracious, what in the world am I going to do? But he sat just as quiet as he could until all of a sudden, one of the heads looked up. There he is, right smack dabbed in the top of that old sycamore tree. And he said, hey, child, young man, what are you doing up there? Jack looked down and he says, I'm curing up new ground. Curing up new ground, said the head right back at him. What in the don't you know that ain't the way you clear up new ground? If you're going to clear up new ground, you got to start at the bottom and work up. He said, come on down here. We'll show you how to clear up new ground, and we'll invite you home for supper, too. He had a real evil grin, if you know what I mean. And Jack knowed. Jack wasn't born yesterday. He knowed he couldn't trust that old giant. He says, well, thank you, sir, but I'm just fine right here. He says, besides that, you look terribly, terribly strong. Yeah, said the other head. I'm as strong as any giant there is in this land. I'm stronger than all my brothers and sisters. I am stronger. And the other head looked at him and said, yeah, but you ain't as smart as I am. Well, I wouldn't say that. Jack said, oh, I can look down at both of you and tell You're extremely strong and are extremely smart. But, and he stopped and he looked at his fingernails and he said, I can do something you can't do. Both heads began to laugh. You know you can't do anything. And he said, I can indeed. So you see that little rock laying over there, and there at the foot of the table was a rock just about the size of a softball. Jack said, and the giant says, yeah, I see it. He said, I can take that rock and mash it and make milk come out of it. Do you believe that? Brother, do you think anybody, any human being, can take an old dry rock and squeeze it and make milk come out of it? No, he's just talking. Jack says, pitch me that rock up here and I'll show you. And the giant reached over, and while he was leaning down to pick that rock up, Jack made a hole in that apron he had put on at lunch that he had filled up with milk. And he made a hole there, and the man and the giant pitched up the rock, and Jack, he reached out, the giant reached out and got it, and he began to squeeze it hard as he could this way, and he squeezed it. And when he did, he mashed on that pocket. And sure enough, right out of that little hole he made with that, he dropped, plop, 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 right smack dabbed in the head of the giant. And he looked up, and he kind of run his teeth around like that. And he said, brother, that's milk sure as you're born. That little boy just squeezed that rock and made milk come out of it. The other giant said, yeah, and anything that little boy can do, we can do better. Jack, toss us that rock down here. He says, fellers, it ain't as easy as it looks like it is. But nevertheless, he reached out and dropped the rock, and the giant reached out and grabbed it and began to squeeze it this way and squish it that way, and it just crumbled all to pieces, but there was nary a drop of milk in it. Well, all but ding dab. He said, brother, that little bitty boy can do something we can't do. That ain't all, said that little bitty boy, Jack, up in the top of that tree. He said, if I had a knife, I could take it and stick it in my tummy and draw it up and open my stomach wide, and every blooming thing I ate at lunch would rain down all around you. And then I could take a piece of rawhide and lace that stomach back up again and tie a pretty little bow right smack dab at the top. And he said, and it would not faze me at all. The giant looked at his brother and said, do you believe that? Why, no. There ain't no mortal human able to do nothing like that. And the giant reached down to the side of his leg and pulled out a big old Bowie knife with a long blade. And he said, Jack, let's see you tried. And he tossed Jack up the knife. And Jack, he reached out, and being very careful that they didn't see what he reached over and stopped the apron he had on that he had filled up with food at the table, and he stuck that knife in just the apron part, split it, and here rained down dumplings and dressing and good things to eat, and it fell. And both giants was looked up with their mouth wide open, and one of them said, you know what? He done exactly what he said. Yeah, said the other head. And anything that little squirt can do, we can do better. And they said, Jack, throw us that knife down. He said, fellers, it ain't as easy as what it looks like. Grinning a kind of evil grin. And he reached down and dropped that knife. And that giant reached out and got it and stabbed himself right smack dabbed in the chest, split his body wide open. And young'uns, You ain't never seen nobody die as hard as that giant did. He fell this way. He tumbled that way. He hit his heels against the ground, and then he was dead as a doornail. Well, said Jack, I ain't too bad at killing giants. And he clomb out of that tree and got down, looked at his watch, and he said, I've been up here 4 hours. That's 4 hours at 50 cents an hour. And he cut off both heads and put them in the sack, because them heads was worth $1,000 apiece. And back he started walking toward the king's house. The queen was standing out there fretting and worrying about him. He's little, he's young, he's probably already dead. And he said, Mama, look yonder. Look yonder. Yonder comes Jack, and he's got something in a sack. And Jack, he said, go find my billfold, Mama. And she went in and got the giant's billfold, and he paid Jack $2 for the amount that he had worked, and gave him $2,000 per head. And he said, Jack, stay on here. There's a whole family of them giants that live over yonder, and they pester me something awful. I'd be plumb proud if you just stay here and get rid of them. Jack, who fully believed that is all the money there was in the world. Now, you and I know there's a lot more money than that. But he said, well, sir, I'm going to take this money back to Mama so she can have plenty to eat and take care of. But if I ever get hard up again, I'll come back and do away with the rest of them giants. So all of the old giant tales, Jack tales, are tales that have how we can't really decide where Jack is a real smart boy or else a real lucky boy. Anyway, that is the second. Now, did you notice the difference in the two styles of story? Each one of them was trying to be suspenseful, which means to make you listen and see what might be going to happen to the hero. But one was told what I call kind of tongue-in-cheek, kind of making fun of it. I love the Jack tale where we never really know, where Jack's not the smartest boy in the world, but maybe just about the luckiest boy that's ever lived. Jack, if you're interested in Jack, there are series of books called The Jack Tales, Appalachian Folk Tales, Grandfather Tales, and there's about 3 or 4 different Jack tale books. Each one of them has a different story that is related to stories that happened long ago. Remember, when you're writing or you're telling a story, that your story is just as important. Learn the skills of writing. Learn the skills of relating. Use how good descriptive adjectives will make things clear. How great action words will make things exciting. And be sure that you tell with good hinge words that said, all of a sudden, and then you can lead right into another paragraph and tell another tale. So until we meet again, let's look for ways to tell our stories so that everybody say, oh, I wish I had said that.